Social Responsibility and Economic Efficiency, Kenneth J. Arrow. Arrow's article is addressing an issue that we've previously encountered in the course, but it also is describing a limit to economics, or the relationship between economic theory and morality. So what Arrow is doing initially is looking at the idealized assumptions that are made by economists. So what we see at the beginning of this excerpt from his work is the idea that economic efficiency, that businesses do good for society by simply doing business. So we've encountered this before. We've encountered this idea with Milton Friedman, that the idea that what business does best is to maximize profits, and so what we should be doing is just simply allowing businesses to do that, because when they maximize profits, then all of us benefit. So the social good is not done by attempting to regulate businesses, nor is it done by trying to make them do morally good acts. What we should simply do is let business do what business does best. Now, this idea is based on certain economic assumptions. So if we sort of abstract from the practical, this business doing its job in a particular society, we can say, well, what do the economists say? Well, the economists say that when we have competition in markets and when firms attempt to maximize profits, that these things will lead to an efficient distribution of goods within society and people will be better off. So there's sort of an abstract level we can pull this to, where we're really making the case that efficient markets are also moral markets, and therefore that businesses shouldn't be socially responsible. Now, if we assume idealized conditions, if we assume that the people in the market have full information, that there's certain shortcomings of the markets don't exist, then this might work from a theoretical perspective. And what Arrow, I think, is doing here, which you can see from his article, is really challenging those assumptions. Although you might not specifically say I'm challenging the assumptions of economics, he is in fact doing that with his article. So the case against social responsibility, the first thing Arrow is doing is saying, well, what's the argument against businesses being socially responsible? And he goes back to the sort of well-worn arguments that we've seen. He says, well, there's two sort of arguments that are made. One is an empirical argument, one's a normative argument. The empirical argument says that firms will maximize profit, right? So the impulse for gain, the individual impulse for gain, is very strong. And because of that strong impulse, people are going to maximize profit, and that controlling that is likely to be ineffective. Most people are going, or most business owners, most people who start companies are going to be motivated to do so by this profit motive, and it's going to be difficult. It's a natural aspect of human beings that they have an impulse for gain. There's a certain greed component to all individuals. So that's the empirical argument. There's also a normative argument, and this is the one we often hear sort of combined, that not only are people, as a matter of fact, motivated by gain, but that firms ought to maximize profit. So again, this is an argument we've seen before. Profit is the net contribution firms make to society. So when you say, what good does a business do? Well, profit is the good that businesses do. Profits generated by companies make society better off, and the benefits of that, or the benefits of the firm, are shared with society. When a firm, and again, firm is just another term for a business or business enterprise, when a firm does well, it makes a profit. Those profits then translate into money given to shareholders, money given to workers, or the hiring of new workers, and then those individuals in turn that money over to society by buying goods or services or investing in other ventures or whatever. You have houses, those sorts of things. So the benefits of the firm are shared with society by this sort of redistribution by individuals. And that's the normative claim, is that we ought to let firms maximize profit. That should be what they do. And so in this ideal world in which we have contracting individuals, one individual contracting with another for goods or services, those being paid a wage, and from that wages, businesses generate their profits and they invest in other things. And we've had all these sorts of arguments before. This idealized economic situation is one in which we all benefit. So as Arrow says, under the proper assumptions, profit maximization is indeed efficient in the sense that it can achieve as high a level of satisfaction as possible for any one consumer without reducing the levels of satisfaction of other consumers or using more resources than a society is endowed with. What he's saying here is that, yes, if we have idealized circumstances, in a situation, given the proper assumptions, there is in fact, or business, our sort of capitalist economic system, is in fact efficient. It takes goods out there, it takes raw materials, translates those or turns those into goods in which one consumer can be satisfied without reducing the level of satisfaction of others. In other words, my going out and buying a computer doesn't mean that somebody goes without a computer. It's not a zero-sum game. And so Arrow says, with these proper assumptions, yes, in fact, there are high levels of satisfaction. But what are the limits of this anti-social responsibility argument? So the idea is that we should leave firms alone to do what they do best. And when they do so, we are going to find that everyone will be better off. Now, he says there's a limit to this. And he starts out with these limits of the social responsibility. He says, first of all, there's an assumption, an implicit assumption in there, that the forces of competition are sufficiently vigorous. So he means that when we assume a marketplace, what we normally assume is that there is competition between various providers and that there isn't a monopoly. So when he says forces of competition are sufficiently vigorous, he notes that we assume that there's no monopoly. A monopoly of service means that I don't have choice, that I can't move to another product or another service. And in those instances, the firm that controls the monopoly can charge whatever they want. So it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be better off. So, of course, we exclude from the free market monopolies, even though monopolies can arise naturally. There are natural monopolies. But that's one instance, and we think there should be some regulation. Another outcome of this unregulated antisocial responsibility argument is that distributions of income of unrestrained maximization is very unequal. So while it's true that on average we're better off when we have this sort of free market, laissez-faire approach to the exchange of goods, it turns out that there's also a very unequal distribution. So notice the mean and the median distinction that you've probably had since maybe 6th or 7th grade when you learned how to do averages, right? There's the average, simply take the total number of goods in society and divide by the number of people, and we come up with an average. Well, it's true, but I could say something like, well, if we have a large number of people making 20,000 and a large number of people making 150,000, and then average that, we'd say, well, look, the average income, depending on the number of people, might be $40,000. You say, well, that sounds very good, except that we don't know what the distribution is. How many people are at 40 or above 40? How many people are below 40? So an average doesn't necessarily tell me how well a society is doing. There might be a very large number of people making a very small amount and a small number making a very large amount. And that may lead to unequal distributions of goods in society, unequal distribution of income. And that isn't necessarily good for society. So one of the things that we note in our current sort of economic situation is that when do companies hire new workers? They hire new workers when people are buying a lot of their product or using a lot of their services. Well, if a large number of people don't have the resources to buy goods or services, then business have no incentive to hire new people. So large income variations, when you have an unequal distribution of income, one of the problems can be that you don't get that income distributed in the way we want in a society. We want people to go to restaurants. We want them to buy clothes because those restaurants employ workers, those clothing stores employ workers, and so forth, and that helps us all out. But if a large number of, or a very small number of people control a large amount of income, it might be the case that they've already satisfied their needs for certain goods or services. And so they're not going to spend their extra resources on doubling up on those goods or services. They're simply going to hold on to that wealth. And so Arrow notes that this might not necessarily be good for a society. Finally, another problem with this is that the antisocial responsibility argument leads to altruism being de-emphasized. Now, altruism is one of those qualities of individuals in which the term altruism itself just means doing good for others. In a market-based system, in a system in which everything is a contract, everything is a negotiation, everything is a product, one of the problems you get is a de-emphasis on just doing good for the sake of goodness. So altruism might be in the form of charity, but it also can be expressed in terms of simply helping others without a regard for profit. And what Arrow notes is that when you have a system in which you rely on the distribution of goods solely from a market-based approach, this tends to reinforce the idea that everything has a price tag, that all forms of help should be sort of put on to a market. And so altruism is a characteristic I think we want in our society. We want people to help others at times without regard for profit. I don't want to see someone who, say, has been in an auto accident and ask how much it would cost for me to call the ambulance for them. Right? We want people to have some instinct towards altruism or some penchant for doing good for others without looking at the profit motive. Now, there are additional problems. If we sort of exclude those initial problems, the problems of monopoly and the de-emphasis of altruism and so forth, there are other additional problems that come from this idea that businesses shouldn't be socially responsible or that businesses don't have social responsibility. And the first and the one that we've talked about before are the idea of externalities. Oftentimes when we talk about business, we ignore certain externalities. That is, the cost businesses impose upon society. So we discussed this in the case of the Walmart and Costco example. How much of Walmart do we subsidize as opposed to how much of Costco do we subsidize because of the way in which they do business? So pollution is a common externality. Many businesses don't factor in pollution into their business costs. So when we're buying a product, we pay more for that product if the pollution that's required to manufacture it, if that cost is put onto us in the form of higher healthcare bills because of things like bad air or water quality, might be in terms of cleanup for the manufacturing process, brownfields and things that are left by manufacturing because that sort of thing hasn't been regulated. So pollution is one of those externalities. In an ideal market, businesses would assume the total cost of production. Whatever it costs to produce, they would include things like pollution. There are other externalities that are difficult even to put a price tag on. So what about things like traffic congestion? Not only does traffic congestion lead to pollution, but it also leads to road wear and tear. It requires the fixing of roads and the maintaining of roads. It may require medical services and that for accidents and so forth. So traffic congestion is a externality that businesses often put onto others, but isn't factored in. Right? So when you build a new plant, when you put a new business up, this is something that occurs, and that congestion is a cost imposed on others. Maybe a bigger problem even than externalities, because we know about externalities, we've seen externalities in a number of cases, is the idea of insufficient knowledge. So business transactions themselves, so we look at this from an economic standpoint, we look at these ideal business actors or actresses, right? So we look at this idea of there's an individual or two individuals making exchange, there's buyers and sellers, and that they engage in a transaction in which both parties have full knowledge. So here again, we're going back to those pure economic assumptions. In a market, in an ideal market, we have full knowledge of the goods being exchanged, and there's a sort of value of those goods set by the exchanges that take place amongst these fully rational actors. But what Arrow notes is that in many economic transactions, buyers and sellers can both lose out. Now, how do they lose? Well, buyers lose because when I go to buy something, so let's take Arrow's own example. It talks about a used car. If I'm looking for a used car, I go to the seller of a used car with cash. The seller knows exactly what I have to offer in exchange. So I'm not exchanging another car for a car. I'm not exchanging a basket full of apples in which some of the apples might be bad in the bottom. I'm bringing to the table cash. So the value of my cash is known simply by the fact that we know how much money I have, right? So you can look at my money. The seller has an advantage though, right? The seller knows the condition of the car. There's a good chance that the seller is well aware of any of the deficiencies of the used car that they're selling. Now, it's possible, of course, for me as a buyer not to know all about that car. I could even have the car inspected. There's something I might miss. There's something the seller might know. So the buyer is at a disadvantage. When there's insufficient knowledge, I may pay more than a car is worth because I don't know all the defects. I lack knowledge that the seller has. But it's not only a one-way street of loss. Sellers can also lose in a transaction like a used car transaction. Since I as a buyer know that I don't know all about that vehicle, it's possible I'm going to pay less than the value of the vehicle. If there was a way to make sure that I had enough knowledge about its value, then it might be the case that, well, I clearly know that this car is worth more. So a seller can lose because a buyer might say, look, I'm bringing to the table money. You know what I have to offer. I don't know what you have to offer, and therefore, I don't trust, for example, that you're telling me the truth. And without any sort of verification, without knowledge, real knowledge about the condition of the vehicle, I might only be willing to pay less than the vehicle's actually worth. And so in that case, the seller loses out. Now, there's only one instance, Arrow notes, in which somebody actually benefits, and that's the dishonest seller. Right? So in a case in which there's insufficient knowledge, the one with more knowledge actually benefits. So in an idealized market, it would actually be good if buyers and sellers had full knowledge and we came to an agreement about what the value of the product was. And that might be set by the number of that type of vehicle, the reliability of that vehicle, the condition of the actual vehicle I'm buying. And both of us know what that is, and we come about what we call a fair price. But with a lack of knowledge, the only people that actually can benefit in some instances are the dishonest sellers. They know what the vehicle is actually worth, and they may actually get someone to pay more than a vehicle is worth. So insufficient knowledge leads to market failures, which leads to people being worse off. And in this case, it can be both buyers and sellers, setting aside for a moment the dishonest seller. Now, what is the response to these limitations of markets, or this limitation of economics and its relation to morality? I think what we want to keep clear here is that what Arrow is doing is showing that economic assumptions, idealized economic assumptions, often lead to less than ideal outcomes in the real world. So that if we rely on economic theory without looking at the realities of economic exchanges in the world, that people can be better off. They can be better off on average, so that this distribution is unequal. There's this lack of knowledge. There's actual harms in terms of externalities. And so in some ways, by Arrow pointing these out, what he's saying is that there are appropriate institutional responses. So for those who would say that we shouldn't compel businesses to behave in certain ways, outside of these sort of minimal standards of someone like a Milton Friedman, that those who make those arguments are missing the broader shortcomings of economic theory in general when it applies to the real world. And so Arrow is really defending institutional responses to market failures, to the failures of economics. Economics is great in terms of theory. Economics can account for a large amount of price variations and supply and demand. It has its place. But economics is not morality. And so that there are justifiable institutional responses to these sorts of market failures. So first, he points out that there's legal regulation, laws that regulate markets and set standards or limits. So we can say, for instance, that products that are unsafe, while you might say, look, if I fully disclose this lack of safety, shouldn't that make it all right? And we might argue that no, people don't have information. They don't always look out for their own well-being. Sometimes they might be motivated by something other than safety. And so we might want to say there are legal regulations that are justifiable, that these make sure that the goods on markets meet a certain standard so that they don't harm individuals, so that individuals can go in and they might not have full knowledge of the product, full knowledge of what it is they're purchasing. So you can take medicine, for example. We might have a large number of regulations regarding doctors and their training and what they can do or what they can't do. We might want to have those regulations because I, as an individual, even if you gave me the information, I might not be able to interpret it properly. So Arrow says one thing we can do is legal regulation. He thinks this is justified, right? Laws that regulate markets or set standards or limits. For example, standards or limits when we're talking about goods or services. Another one, this is the one, the institution of choice for economists, as Arrow notes, is the notion of taxation. Make firms literally assume the cost of doing business. So some of this is a sort of trade in pollution credits. I say, look, you as a business impose a cost on me. You impose a cost when you pollute. You impose a cost when you take advantage of services like police or fire. You take advantage of me when you don't provide workers enough money and then rely on the social safety net to take care of the people who work for you, or when you lay off workers and then rely on extended benefits from the government. So all of those things are costs that you haven't factored into your business. And so Arrow says, look, one of the things that justifiable is the idea of taxing businesses for the actual cost of doing business. And by doing so, that might mean that businesses take greater care in the way in which they go about doing business. It might mean that we as consumers pay more. But of course, if you have competition and if all businesses are taxed accordingly, then those things should, from an economic standpoint, keep prices fairly stable. But he thinks that it's justified, that to say that you can't tax businesses and you can't tax businesses to do some sort of social good is wrong, because businesses, in fact, do impose a cost on us. And so taxing businesses so that they do assume the cost of actually doing business would be justified. Legal liability, of course, is the other response we can give. So similar to legislative action, legal liability is where we allow the civil law to do what it ought to do. That is, we ought to allow people to sue for damages. So one way, or another way, I should say, of regulating business, of making sure that businesses are kept honest, that the only motivation isn't profit, is to allow individuals to take businesses to court when they do things that are harmful. And this is a way of regulating business on a case-by-case basis. Or in the case, in certain cases where we have class action suits, where we say there is a harm that's been done to a large number of individuals here. It's a harm that may have slipped through the legislative process. It's a harm that isn't covered by taxation. Well, now we've got the civil law to correct on this. I can go and sue a business to make sure that they are abiding by certain standards. And this is the sort of thing that happened in the Ford Pinto case, where Ford knowingly produced an automobile that had a habit of catching on fire when struck from behind. Now, it met certain applicable federal laws, so it was still legally okay, but there was still room for civil cases to be brought. And this is actually what cost Ford far more money than they expected, because there were punitive damages. That's fine. The car or the amount that was given in damages to the individuals might have been fairly low. But the courts also said this is a way in which we can regulate this sort of business practice that we find morally abhorrent, right? That there's something wrong here, that a company shouldn't be allowed to do this. And this is where sort of punitive damages come in. And so legal liability, Arrow thinks, is an important way of regulating business. And finally, ethical codes. Now, Arrow says that, look, we normally want to divorce ethics from business, right? So in that anti-social responsibility, what's anti-social responsibility but saying that you don't have moral obligations, that you as a business are just there to do business? And so Arrow thinks there's some value in doing or viewing ethical codes as regulating business. And he says this has been successful to a large degree in medicine, that doctors are restricted. Even in for-profit hospitals or for-profit medical groups, there are still codes of ethics that regulate what doctors can and cannot do. And Arrow says, let's be realistic about this, that although economic theory has these notions of contracts and possibly promises, that really what is required for all business transactions is a minimal sort of ethical code, right? I have to trust that when I buy a product, when I give you money to deliver dirt for my backyard or crushed gravel for my walkway, that you're actually going to do it after I give you the money. So we have an agreement, we can make a contract, but note that that contract implicitly relies on a certain trust between the payee and the payer, right? So that we're going to say, look, I know that a week from now you're going to deliver that to my house, that you're not going to run away with the money. So there's a certain amount of trust there. I mean, we can reinforce that through legal means, but it's also the case that generally speaking, we simply rely on trust and promises. And the same goes with contracts. There is no contract that spells out every single aspect of the relationship between the two individuals. there are always sorts of gray areas or just assumptions that are in a contract that aren't explicitly stated. Think about what it would mean to explicitly state every step of a contract. Sort of like when you have to explicitly state every step of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. All right, so if I say, make me a peanut butter sandwich, someone would say, how do you make a peanut butter sandwich? And you may say, well, first you get some bread, and you get your jar of peanut butter, and you get your jar of jelly. And then you take and put some peanut butter on the bread, you put some jelly on the bread, maybe you put the jelly on one slice, you put the peanut butter on the other, depending on how you like to make your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then you put the two pieces of bread together, and then you cut it. Now that sounds fine, except that in that description, if I said, well, you put the peanut butter on the bread, does that mean I put the whole can of peanut butter on the bread? I didn't say you have to unscrew the top, and then you stick the knife into the peanut butter, and you take enough on the knife, and then you put that onto the bread, and you spread that across the bread. Notice that I haven't spelled out every single little step of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but we understand, of course, that all those things are in there. That I'm going to open the jars of peanut butter, that I'm not putting the whole jar on the bread, and so forth. And the same goes for contracts. And those assumptions, says Arrow, are basically our sort of code of social ethics. We understand that there's certain things going on, that there's going to be a time lapse, that I'm going to give you money, and that you're going to bring the stuff that doesn't have to occur simultaneously, that the minute I hand you the money, the dump truck dumps the stuff in my yard. So ethics takes or has a place in business. It's already there. And by looking only at the sort of abstract economic theory, we miss the fact that those economic theories really do implicitly rely on a certain social code in order for them to take place.